The year was 1968, and Leonard Bernstein was standing in front of a room full of journalists, doing what he did best, talking about music like it was something only a certain kind of person could truly understand. He had just finished conducting at Carnegie Hall. His suit was still pressed. His confidence was the kind that doesn't come from arrogance alone, but from decades of being told consistently that you are the most important person in the room. And somewhere in that conversation, someone asked him about what was happening in Detroit, about Motown, about soul music, about the voices coming out of those small studios on West Grand Boulevard that were starting to drown out everything else on the radio. Bernstein paused. Then he said something that would find its way, slowly, through the music industry's grapevine until it reached a recording studio in Detroit where a young man was sitting alone, listening. He called it emotionally raw but musically undeveloped. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The words got to Marvin Gaye on a Tuesday. A session musician who'd been at the press event passed them along secondhand, the way bad news always travels, casually like it's nothing, which somehow makes it worse. Marvin was at Motown's Hitsville studio, sitting in the back of the control room, not recording, just thinking, which he did more than people realized. He heard the quote. He didn't say anything for a long time. The engineer in the room that day later recalled that Marvin just nodded slowly, like he was filing something away. Not angry, not hurt, something quieter than both of those things. Here is what you need to understand about Leonard Bernstein in 1968. He wasn't just a conductor. He was the closest thing classical music had to a public intellectual. The man who had made West Side Story, who gave televised lectures at Harvard that people actually watched, who could explain Beethoven to a taxi driver and make it land. When Bernstein spoke about music, it wasn't opinion, it was verdict. And his verdict on what was happening in soul music was that it lacked structure, that it was feeling without architecture, that it was, in the most polite possible terms, not fully formed. What Bernstein didn't know, what he couldn't have known from where he was standing, was that Marvin Gaye had been quietly falling apart for 2 years. Tammy Terrell had collapsed on stage in his arms in 1967. She was still alive, barely, cycling through surgeries that weren't working. Marvin had been going through the motions at Motown, recording the hits they asked him to record, smiling in the photos, performing the version of himself that sold records. But something had been building inside him, a question he couldn't stop asking, something between rage and grief, and a need to say something real for the first time in years. He just hadn't found the door yet. Bernstein's words didn't open the door, but they told Marvin exactly what was waiting on the other side of it. The people at Motown saw none of this coming. That's the part that still feels almost absurd in retrospect. Berry Gordy had built one of the most successful record labels in American history by understanding precisely what the market wanted. And what the market wanted in 1968 was not a concept album about Vietnam and poverty in a country coming undone. What the market wanted was more of what had already worked, more duets, more dancing, more of the Marvin who made girls scream and mothers approve. So when Marvin started talking about making something different, something that actually meant something, the response was gentle but firm. You're a hit machine. Don't break the machine. There were meetings. There were conversations in hallways where producers explained, patiently, that this wasn't what his audience expected, that political music was a risk, that risk was expensive, that Marvin should think carefully about what he was doing. Marvin listened to all of it. He nodded in the right places, and then he went back to the studio. What happened next didn't happen overnight. It happened in pieces, over months, in late sessions when the building was mostly empty, and Marvin could work without someone looking over his shoulder. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He was trying to make something honest, which had started to feel like the same thing. His brother Frankie had come back from Vietnam, changed in ways that couldn't be explained in a conversation. Marvin had sat with him and listened, and what he heard wasn't just one man's story. It was a frequency, something underneath the surface of everything happening in the country, a low hum of damage that nobody in the music industry seemed to want to name. Marvin wanted to name it. The vocal sessions for what's going on are the part of this story that the engineers who were there have talked about the most years later in interviews where they still seemed slightly bewildered by what they witnessed. Marvin didn't work the way other artists worked. He didn't come in with everything planned. He came in with a feeling and then chased it through the microphone until he caught it. He would sing a line 15 times and stop not when it sounded right technically, but when it felt like he'd actually meant it. The difference to an outside ear was almost invisible. To Marvin, it was everything. The night he recorded the title track's vocal layers, something shifted in the room. He had asked the engineers to give him space. Fewer people, lower lights, no one talking unless they had to. He stood at the microphone and sang the melody clean once. No harmonies, just the core of it. Then he went back and sang it again, slightly higher. Then again, lower. He was building something from the inside out, stacking his own voice against itself until the song had a kind of depth that didn't come from the arrangement or the instrumentation. It came from him, layered the way a choir works, except every voice in the choir was the same voice carrying a slightly different weight. One of the engineers said later that he stopped watching the meters at some point. He was just listening. That's not something engineers usually admit. This is where the Bernstein thread comes back in, and it comes back quietly. Because what Marvin built in those sessions was structurally something that classical musicians would later spend real time analyzing. The vocal harmonics and what's going on, the way the voices move against each other, the way tension is built and released across phrases. These are not accidents. They're not raw, feeling unguided by craft. They are the product of someone who had spent years absorbing music, all kinds of music, and had developed an instinct for structure that didn't look like Bernstein's structure because it came from somewhere Bernstein had never been. When the album was finished, Marvin played it for Gordy. Gordy's response was immediate and certain. This was not releasable. It was too slow, too political, too strange, too far from what Marvin's audience expected. He told Marvin directly that releasing this record would hurt his career. He wasn't being cruel. He believed it. He had the receipts to back up his instincts. And every instinct he had was telling him this was a mistake. Marvin went home and did not record anything for months. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just stopped. And that silence, it turned out, was louder than any conversation. Because Motown needed Marvin Gaye. Not a version of Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye specifically, that specific voice, that specific pull he had on an audience. Without him recording, there was a gap, and the gap didn't close. It just sat there, costing money, until Gordy had to make a decision about what he was more afraid of, the album or the silence. What's Going On was released in May 1971. It sold 100,000 copies in its first week. Critics who had spent years writing about soul music as entertainment suddenly found themselves writing about it as art. The album went to number 6 on the pop charts and number 1 on the R&B charts. It did not hurt Marvin's career. Gordy called it one of his biggest mistakes, not releasing the album, blocking it. He said that publicly years later, in the way people admit things once enough time has passed, that the admission cost nothing. But the cost in real time had been Marvin's year of silence, Motown's year of pressure, and all the conversations in all the hallways where people had tried to explain to a man what kind of music he was allowed to make. What reached the classical music world happened slowly, the way influence usually does. There was no moment where Bernstein sat down and publicly reversed his position. It was subtler than that. Musicians who had trained in conservatories started listening to the album and noticing things. The way Marvin used counterpoint in the vocal arrangements, voices moving in opposite directions to create harmony, was structurally sophisticated in ways that demanded a vocabulary beyond raw and undeveloped. A musicologist at Columbia wrote a short paper comparing the harmonic movement in What's Going On to certain Bach cantatas, not as flattery, but as analysis. The paper circulated. Bernstein, by most accounts, heard the album. He didn't write about it. He didn't give interviews about it. But people in his circle have said over the years that his language about popular music changed after 1971, that he stopped using the word primitive, that when students asked him about soul music, he no longer dismissed it with the confidence he'd had at that press conference in 1968. Something had recalibrated. It may not sound like much. It probably doesn't if you're looking for a confrontation, for a moment where the man who said the wrong thing is made to stand in front of the man he wronged and account for himself. That scene never happened. Real life rarely gives you that scene, but here is what did happen. A man who had been told his music was structurally undeveloped made an album whose structure is still being studied. A man who worked in a converted house on a residential street in Detroit, with engineers who were figuring things out as they went, built something that 100 years of formal music education had not produced. Not because he ignored structure, but because he understood it well enough to come at it from a direction nobody expected. Marvin never mentioned Bernstein in any interview. There's no record of him responding to the quote directly, not publicly, not even privately as far as anyone knows. He didn't need to. He was already in the studio by the time the words had finished traveling, already building something, already answering a question that the person who asked it didn't know he'd asked. That's how it works sometimes. The clearest responses are the ones that don't look like responses at all. They just look like someone doing their work. Have you ever created something that people said couldn't be done? Not because they were cruel, but because they genuinely couldn't see it yet. Tell us in the comments what it took to keep going.